Good afternoon and welcome to the May 2022 ICIT Fellow Insights Roundtable. My name is Drew Spaniel and I'm the lead researcher for ICIT, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. If you are unfamiliar with ICIT, or if this is your first time joining us, the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology is a 501c3 nonprofit that is focused on nonpartisan, objective, and vendor-agnostic cybersecurity research. ICIT's mission is to cultivate a cybersecurity renaissance that will improve the resiliency of our nation's 16 critical infrastructure sectors, defend our democratic institutions, and empower generations of cybersecurity leaders. Each month, ICIT fulfills its mission by hosting events and webinars, and by developing and releasing white papers, a legislative and agency initiatives briefing, fellows' perspective essays, and other content that is focused on improving the security and resiliency of U.S. critical infrastructure. You can engage with ICIT via our website, www.icitech.org, and on LinkedIn. Each quarter, ICIT releases a Fellow Insights Roundtable that showcases our fellows' perspectives on a timely cybersecurity topic. Today, we are discussing how should legislators and agency leaders deter cyber attacks incited by geopolitical conflict. Today are 4 ICIT fellows. Laura Whitt-Winyard is an award-winning Chief Information Security Officer at Malwarebytes. She is also an International Advisory Board member and Women in Technology Board member at HMG Strategy. Prior to her time at Malwarebytes, she was the Global Chief Information Security Officer for DLL Group, Director of Security for Billtrust, and held senior leadership positions in security at Comcast and Bloomberg LP. Sean Zadig is Vice President, Chief Information Security Officer, and Chief Paranoid for Yahoo. Love that term. He's been with the company for 8 years. Before taking on the CISO role at Yahoo, he was the Vice President of Cyber Defense. He also spent time at Google and NASA working on cybercrime. Steve Kappanos is ManTech's Vice President and Cognitive Cyber Technology Focus Area Lead, responsible for new innovations and capabilities that turn cybersecurity relevant data into insights that support mission operators. Michael Eisenberg is an attorney with 47 years experience supporting federal agencies, international bodies, and businesses in matters of national security, law, and policy. He is chair of the ABA Information Security Committee and a member of the National Conference of Lawyers and Scientists. Welcome all of you, and we appreciate having your insight into this discussion. Jumping into the questions that ICIT has solicited from its community, let's begin with what more should legislators or the executive branch be doing to minimize the frequency or impact of geopolitically motivated cyber attacks, and what measures do you feel have a high or low impact on reducing this category of cyber? Sean, let's start with you.
Yeah, great question, and thanks for having me here. You know, I think from my perspective as leading security for a private sector entity that has a global population, I think really the executive branch and legislators should be looking at how to impose costs on the adversaries who are conducting these attacks. Or who are sort of facilitating and encouraging them. I think we all have an understanding that these adversaries, they don't play by the rules. We as sort of, the United States or countries or companies that are headquartered here, we tend to follow norms. I think cyber norms, and the adversaries that we are up against frequently do not. So they might go after targets that we wouldn't go after, and that includes, journalists, that includes activists. They might leverage criminal groups where such, leverage might be distasteful or unethical for us as defenders. And so, I really think the policymakers should be focusing on ways to impose costs on these adversaries that are meaningful. And as an example of a cost imposition that worked for at least for a little while was when President Obama met with President Hu of China, and there were actually some meaningful detectable drop-offs and Chinese cyber activity for a while at least. So I think that is focusing on what costs can be imposed, financial, diplomatic, reputational, across the spectrum. That should be something that is on the table, I would say.
Excellent. Stephen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I love that piece, Sean. I really like to raise the cost. So there's also the technical cost, right? So how much does it cost to conduct a successful cyber campaign? And so when you talk about raising the bar and you look at ways to, I don't know that you can address the frequency, but when you look at how do you reduce the impact and how do you minimize the effectiveness, that's going to contribute to raising the technical cost. If it's harder to have an impact, if it's harder to be effective, then that technical cost is going to go up, and it's going to be harder to achieve objectives through those means. And I think we've seen a lot of changes, both executive and legislative, over the past year and a half, 2 years in the cyberspace. So they are working hard to kind of strike that balance between raising the bar, incident reporting, CISA now doing the known exploited cyber vulnerability publication. I think that's a real big one. And I think that as CISA works with the JCDC and starts working on the public-private partnership and moving from information sharing to collaboration and bringing in that common understanding of how defense works and exercising together, I think those are going to be huge benefits to being able to raise the bar and make it harder to be effective in cyber campaigns.
I agree completely. Laura, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked what Stephen was saying, and I agree about collaboration, but I would also ask that, we should collaborate more across different countries. We're not the only ones experiencing this issue. And I think one of the things that we learned in cybersecurity as a whole is, if you remember 15 years ago, cybersecurity, the cybersecurity community, they didn't really collaborate too much with each other. And now we're all collaborating a lot more, and that gives us a lot more information and a lot more ammunition, if you will, to block or to prevent or reduce or minimize. And I think if we did more collaborating with other countries, I think that would be a huge benefit.
And our audience will recall that on our legislative briefing, we have discussed in the past 3 months briefings a number of bills that specifically focus on cybersecurity collaboration with the international community. Michael, do you have anything to add?
I really think we need to take a higher level cut on this in order to have our domestic policy agenda come into sync with our aspirations for a global policy agenda. And that may be hard given the duplicity with which we have come to operate recently in the public policy arena, the gap between morality and our ethical system. But one of the fundamental values that we will often declare to be intrinsic to our information technology environment is a respect for privacy and the protection of individuals' data. But yet we in the United States still have yet to pass a meaningful federal privacy statute, and efforts at coming up with a global system of privacy that reflects a shared belief system around the value of individuals and their personality that's consistent with what for many decades we have believed to be the American approach to privacy and the importance of protecting personal information and personal data. I think that's a disconnect that we have to address. I've often said that we need to start getting our domestic house in order regarding privacy and the protection and aggressive signs of displeasure against hacking and cyber attacks at the international level first, and the United States can become part of an effective global system. But until we have a world order of privacy, I think it's going to be very hard to have a domestic U.S. environment that's free of cyber attack, or even get any public policy institution, whether it's at the federal legislative level, executive departments, or even individual states, to pass meaningful legislation that truly provides remedies against cyber attacks, which are now, I think, sort of dismissed as part of the price we pay for a very economically valuable information technology environment. So the clash between ethics and economics, I think, continues to work against us getting a good public policy solution here.
Drew, can I actually love to react to something that Stephen said.
Sure.
So Stephen had mentioned the technical costs, and I think that's entirely right. I think, you know, we should force the attackers to bring their A team, and oftentimes the B or the C team will do the job. And you mentioned CISA. I think CISA is a great example of an organization that is really feels like it's doing a lot now. And them as well as frankly the FBI have shown a much more recent pivot toward a willingness to burn sources and methods, and instead of just sort of sitting in a corner and writing IRRs or passively collecting intelligence, they're much more focused on disruption, and that could be technical disruption. It could be naming and shaming of actors, or maybe even at the national level. And I think more of that is also what we want to see as well, is because I think on the private sector we can benefit from the IOCs that are shared, the TTPs that are shared, whereas before those were really closely held or maybe shared in a sort of tear-line fashion that we couldn't make much use of them. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of echo, I think, what you were saying there.
Well, actually, that's a great lead-in, Sean, for our next question, which is how are agencies responding to the influx of cyber attacks, and what more should they be doing or doing differently to better inform and enable the defense of critical infrastructure? So I think you kind of answered that pretty succinctly, but let's go to Laura. Laura, what are your thoughts?
I agree with what Sean was saying and Stephen about, CISA doing a lot now. Their public facing, engagement, I think, is much better than it's been in a very, very long time. I think also, when I think back to the Cyber Shield legislation and how it was brought before the Senate several times and just hasn't really gone anywhere, and it's such a beautiful piece of legislation. It's almost as if we need time for like a section of time for Congress to focus only on cybersecurity, because a lot of times it gets caught up in everything else and all the day-to-day, and cybersecurity kind of keeps getting kicked down the road. And I know we've recently passed legislation when it comes to breach reporting and stuff like that, and that's all well and good, but that's after the fact, and I'd like a little bit more proactive legislation.
Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the Cyber Shield Act, because I think that's a good example of where, when something gets stuck in the legislative loop, agencies can step in and at least not necessarily make it regulatory, but at least release guidance in that space. And with Cyber Shield, recently it was incorporated into NIST's IoT guidance that it has released. Not the full bill in all its entirety, but provisions including the label for IoT devices that's dynamic, that reports the cybersecurity of the individual device, and those kind of things were all incorporated into the NIST guidance that was recently released earlier this year. So I think that's an interesting example.
Yeah, I really liked. If I recall, we were chatting once on one of our meetings about the Cyber Shield and almost making it like similar to the Energy Star rating, where different items would actually get a sticker, so that consumers would see that it had passed the Cyber Shield review. And I mean, I think that would be an amazing thing, something like that, to actually get consumers more focused on cybersecurity.
Right, and that's where the NIST guidance actually uses that label, and they model it on Energy Star. What it doesn't do, and where the legislative community needs to be involved with that particular example, is that the NIST bill specifies that they are not the ones to sort of implement this as regulation, or to sort of manage the program itself, and they leave it up to Congress to determine, if it was going to be something like the Energy Star system, who is going to manage that? Is it going to be an agency or a body that is designated by Congress? NIST just specifies, here's the framework to do it, but we are not the ones actively doing this.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting transformation. Again, it's definitely not what everyone who supported that bill wanted, but it's somewhere where agencies can step in and sort of at least try to improve cybersecurity when things get stuck in the legislative cycle. Michael, what are your thoughts on agency response to cyber attacks?
I, for one, think that there's more than enough response coming from NIST, and at least into the federal agencies, and the challenge is to, again, overcome another example of duplicity. It's very difficult to prescribe behaviors for federal agencies in order to get them to have good firewalls and good protection against attacks, and then out of the other side of their mouth, enable and pass budgets for hacking to be done by our own national security community against our adversaries in retaliation for their attacks on us. We need some international norms here, and we need some good faith negotiation to try and not only take our adversaries out of the loop to the extent possible, but to lead by example and perhaps reduce our reliance on our very robust skill sets. The fact that we're able to execute high quality attacks against our adversaries doesn't mean we always should. And the irritation that it produces, particularly among the Chinese and the Russians, and their substantiated attribution for a good many of the attacks against our private sector, means that the asymmetry is going to continue to be greatly irritating. U.S. interests are not going to go attacking private entities in foreign countries unless they are directly linked to host government abuses. But the fact that we train, enable, and have alumni from our own national security cyber attack communities frequently populating the private sector agencies that then go on and make those skills available on a worldwide basis leaves our hands just a little bit dirty. So I really go back to one of Laura's earlier points. I think there is a vacuum of diplomacy and international engagement that we really need to pick up on and lead by example. I think there are many nation states that are tired of helping their private sector entities clean up the messes created by attacks against important infrastructure institutions. But the only way to really change, to get a sea change in that regard, is if the US and our allies lead by example. Obviously, a very difficult thing to do in the current environment, where effectively we are at war with one of the primary perpetrators of cyber attacks on a global basis, and not being privy to the current intelligence about how much we're doing. I can only assume, based on history, that we're doing quite a bit to try and disable Russia's abilities to use its network assets, and also operating under a very high wall of defensiveness. But when things finally do quiet down in the Ukraine, hopefully as they will, we need to think about a very aggressive reintroduction into the international community of a set of principles that all nations can be asked to sign on to, that will reduce not only attacks by nation states, but also the incentives that the private sector actors have for behaving badly, and flip that energy onto the other side, as Sean and Stephen were talking about investing in much better quality skills on the defensive side and making sure the walls are there to protect the assets, both for operating concerns and all their customers' private information.
Excellent. Stephen?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to hit on. You've covered a lot of ground already. One of them, we're in mid-May, and this week there was a Q&A out in Politico with Ed Neuberger and Chris Inglis, right? And they hit on sense of urgency. So I think that's important as we go through and we see all of these legislative and executive order impacts that come out and all of the new efforts these government agencies have to support. It's being able to have that sense of urgency to get to completion while not being overwhelmed by new legislative actions and executive orders that come out, right? And that's going to be a hard balance for folks to deal with. But really making sure that sense of urgency doesn't go away, I think, is very important. Next thing I'd hit on would be, it's not just going to be yesterday's problems that we need to address. And I think we kind of get focus on that, right? We look at what was recently successful and we focus on that, and we don't think what could be next, and we don't kind of take an adversarial approach as we look at our own defenses and understand where we're strong, where we're weak, and really concentrating on the where we're weak and making sure that we're addressing, things that may come out and not things that have just recently happened. And lastly, workforce. We need to develop the current generation, the next generation, and successor generations of the cyber talent. And again, mid-May and this week, they just pushed out that they're going to work on a rotational program for federal cybersecurity experts where they can move between agencies. I know there's been talk about it. I think a way for public and private to share workforce in some rotational capacity would be excellent as well. How can these private and public, government versus private sector companies, are very different. They operate very differently. And I think part of the reason why collaboration is hard from time to time and exercising together is hard from time to time is we just don't understand how each other work. There's not a good understanding of why government does the things the way they do. Government may not understand as well why private companies do things the way they do. And I think if we can develop the workforce really well and work on that kind of rotational aspect where you get to experience both, I think that could have huge benefits.
I think Stephen's point is really important. I think, and back to the fundamental values issue that I was raising earlier, I think there are some fundamental operating values that are readily distinguishable between senior careerists in federal agencies and those in the private sector. And trustworthiness is something that we've been working on extensively at MITRE, and a system of trust for addressing supply chain challenges is something that there's been a lot of investment in pursuit of. But the perspective on trustworthiness is wildly different if you are on the producer end of microelectronics or software, as opposed to being on the acquiring and using customer end, and considerably different also whether you happen to be in a federal agency or other government entity, as opposed to being in a commercial for-profit entity. Your value system is just going to be shaded by where you stand, depends on where you sit kind of formulation. But I think the idea of job sharing and integration to help enculturate each with the other's set of values, I would particularly emphasize the trust as the top of the list.
I think it's actually interesting that I think each of you, to one degree or another, touch on things like workforce and international collaboration, because from an adversarial perspective, both of those are also focus areas when they develop their attacks. We're seeing an increasing trend, especially among nation states and sophisticated APTs, including some cybercriminal organizations, where they are weaponizing the lower sophistication attackers as part of their multi-vector attack strategy. Russia, China, Syria, even Ukraine now have all, to one degree or another, leveraged lower sophistication professionals within larger attack campaigns or full-on APTs. So reflecting on, I think that heavily complicates the, you know, setting things like international bylines. And I think from a cyber workforce perspective, you know, we're seeing the adversaries pull people into the workforce, but that also pulls those folks out of, you know, a national workforce, or, you know, some people can ride the line if it's a nation state APT, but I think from a international agreement conflict, it definitely adds some obfuscation. So not to overcomplicate it too much, what I want to ask the panelists is, do the strategies and responses that you all mentioned earlier for the legislative community and for agencies, do those scale and apply in response to this more amorphic attack vector where lower sophistication adversaries are weaponized? And how does that change as those types of attacks increase in frequency? Michael, let's start with you on this one.
I think scalability is very much a function of the again, the where you stand depends on where you sit phenomena. Scalability in government is more readily achievable because of the ability to have a control command environment at agencies, both because of the bureaucratic structure, the civilian agencies, and the rank hierarchy of military agencies. Much more difficult to enforce it in the business environment, especially with the flattening of management structures and so much of American business today, especially American technology business. So you have a much more diverse and dynamic workforce, and the installation of value structures across that kind of a community with consistency is much harder. And in fact, there's an enforced toleration of not only diverse views but outlier views that's often being welcomed as a seasoning element to the culture of a community. With government, obviously, that is more readily controlled and is often in some government communities specifically either prohibited or at least discouraged. To then try to extrapolate this on to a global level and look for uniformity, I think that the solution set has to start with KISS, with keeping it very simple. The principles that you try to instill on a global basis and share with those who were either our overt adversaries or at least engaged in adversarial behavior, to get them to join in some sort of an international dialogue and ultimately an international framework, has to be a minimal set. You're not going to get a complex set of new values and new behaviors instilled in a nation that was profiting from, or at least believed it was gaining advantage by tweaking even its biggest business partners. And the China-U.S. relationship obviously is probably the paramount one on a global basis, where the economic relationship is of an enormous level, and the polarity between our value system and much of the Chinese cultural value system couldn't be more in opposition to each other and more antithetical. So I think the solution set starts with simplicity and focusing on a couple of very minimal elements of shared value and shared common aspirations going into the future. The health of your national population, the continued thriving of your national economy, and what are the steps to get there. One I would argue that might fit well is the notion of a shared set of bases of common trust.
Great. Stephen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. So the goals and the sophistication of the adversaries is kind of what we're touching on with this question. And there's different schools of thoughts on whether or not the intent of the adversary changes your defensive posture, changes how you should look at your defenses. Sean mentioned earlier, getting to the point where the B and C teams aren't being successful, right? Let's make sure we've raised the bar to the point where it takes the A team. All of these things, I think, come back to the same point, which is having a certain level of cyber hygiene within an organization and making that a priority, and understanding where and when and why you fail, and taking that forward to not just address what happened the past, but to look at ways you can make improvements in the future. Again, going back to that, you're not just solving for what's happened yesterday or the current threat vectors. There's going to be new threat vectors. So I'd look at it from the standpoint of whether it's ransomware or the B team or the C team, or whether it's we're talking about, what was the title of this talk, where we're talking about geopolitical conflict, right, which comes up to the kind of the nation state level. The cyber hygiene really needs to get to the point where it's a high baseline and it's not the B's and C's teams that are getting in. I think that would be the point I'd make on that topic.
Great. Laura, what do you think?
I mean, to be honest, I'd really like to see more engagement between the public sector and the government sector. If I think about, the DARPA Grand Cyber Challenge that happened at DEF CON, or the Pentagon, hack the Pentagon type things, those type of events where there's a lot more interaction between, the private sector and the government and the military agencies, I think only benefits us. We're all in this together. That goes, and I keep preaching collaboration over and over again, but it's not just collaboration with other countries, it's collaboration with our citizens, collaboration with our legislators, collaboration with our corporations that are based in the US. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to try and solve it by ourselves. We can all work together. Honestly, there's really no solving it per se, but at least we can get to the point where, like Stephen and Sean were saying, the B and C team aren't, successful.
Great. And Sean, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I do, yeah. So I think, your question is, should there be, or is there any difference between the, the response from the government to these sort of high sophistication, APT actors versus like the sort of lower skilled, at a distance attackers? And I think the answer is, right now there is a difference. So you do see some different responses. But, I think in an ideal state, there wouldn't be. Like, I think, for example, if we see a ransomware gang target critical infrastructure or hospitals in close proximity to a, geopolitical event, I think, publicly, we all sort of have an idea who's behind it or sponsoring it, or at least looking the other way. Intelligence agencies probably have, reporting that may confirm some of that. So, I think the government should treat that attack as if it were done by an APT actor, even though there's a little bit of plausible deniability, perhaps on the part of the nation state that's sponsoring it. I think for us, it's less on who the attacker is and their skill set versus what's the motivation. What is the goal they're fulfilling for their sponsor? What tactics are they employing? Who's funding them? That sort of thing is more important for us, I think, as defenders. And then, having sort of an all-of-government approach that penalizes the host country for launching these sort of like skills or the attacks that give them a bit of plausible deniability, perhaps. So if we, as a as a private sector and government, can treat the high-skilled APT actors in a similar way as the lower-skilled cutouts that are doing the work of those adversaries, then I think we'll be in a better position.
I agree, and I think maybe a discussion around whether or not obfuscation and difficulty in attribution, makes international agreements more complicated. I think that may be a discussion for a follow-up conversation or a publication. But maybe to wrap up today's discussion, I kind of want to take what Laura mentioned and what you just said, Sean, and look at it from a more microscopic level. So when attribution isn't known and when we don't necessarily know a geopolitical motive, usually that attack is coming in at the agency level or at the private organization level, right? So we've discussed already how agencies should maybe at a high level improve their responses. how should the private sector respond? You know, should they take a stance in these international conflicts? Is it, you know, better to quietly handle the cyber attack and report it to the applicable agency, or is there merit in a more, you know, a very public or proactive response to disincentivize attackers from the various levels of sophistication? I guess maybe a shorter and more concise version of my question is, what do each of you feel is a more appropriate and balanced response for private sector organizations to take in response to some of these cyber attacks? And Stephen, let's start with you on this one.
Wow, lead off with me on the hard question.
It's wrapping up. It's coming to the end of the webinar. We had to ramp up difficulty as we went.
Yeah, I think how an organization should handle this at the high level is really up to the organization, right? From the standpoint of, does your response change maybe how you're being targeted? Yeah, I think it definitely would change how you could be targeted. So depending upon what your response is and how an organization goes about things, it could change, you know, what adversaries are looking at them and the frequency and scale of the efforts that are being put against them.
Great. Sean, do you have any thoughts?
So I think this is it is a difficult question, actually, and part of it the answer may kind of depend on like which part of the private sector you're in. So for example, you know, Yahoo, the company I work for, we are a company, even though we're headquartered in the United States, we have, you know, offices and employees all over the world. We serve a global population. And so, you know, aligning ourselves to the interests of the US government, for example, or, you know, in response to an attack can be difficult. And frankly, you know, we have to sort of look out for all of our users all over the world, not just, you know, the ones in the US. So one of the ways that we are approaching it is, you know, we take sort of a behind the scenes approach, and we might, you know, notify users who are being targeted by APT attacks and let them know that they're being targeted by these adversaries who can do them harm in the real world. And as opposed to kind of maybe taking a more public stance and you know, outing or doxing attackers, or going sort of publicly one way or another about sort of geopolitics. We're sort of in the school that it's more important to, you know, maybe be behind the scenes doing the good work as opposed to, you know, being sort of upfront and public and, you know, tweeting loudly about it, perhaps. But, you know, other private companies who don't have that same sort of user base or are in different industry may have a different approach.
Great. Laura, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, to Sean's point, it's a fine balance. You know, working for a cybersecurity company, if we take a public stance on something that could, number one, open us up for an onslaught of attacks, right? I mean, if you think about some of the things that have been going on with Ukraine and Russia, but at the same point, you know, we want to do everything we can to help our customers, help other companies, even other countries if need be. But like Sean was saying, we do that on the download. You know, be the silent hero, if you will. We're not all you know, able to go and move Starlinks into place to help a country get internet connection right away. But yeah, I think it depends on the situation, and you know, there's a lot of good work that's being done that isn't being publicized, and it's probably for the best that it's not.
Great. And last but not least, Michael, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think what we've been talking about here in these last few minutes is the pursuit of a normative system to underpin behavior within the private sector, which ideally should be reflective of not only industry, but national and potentially, as I said much earlier, global values. But the achievement of those normative systems is difficult, especially when you have a dysfunctional governmental process in our case, a dysfunctional legislature, but the articulation of norms, the achievement of a statement of those norms, and ultimately the enforcement of those norms is certainly very difficult at the global level, not an insignificant task at the national level, and perhaps, as my panel colleagues have just been saying, not even readily achievable even at the company or industry-wide level. So there's a lot of sweat equity that's going to have to be invested in order to come up with shared systems that produce changes in behavior that we will view as positive in this environment that at the moment is characterized by an awful lot of bad behavior that we all wish we could get rid of. And clearly, as we've said in the last hour, the routes to fixing that are difficult.
Great, and I think we're coming up on time, so I want to wrap up with maybe just a final follow-up, and feel free to jump in, go in order, however you want to follow off of each other to respond to this. But what, given that the role of the private sector or how the private sector responds to international conflict is very complicated, right? What actionable recommendations would you have for private sector companies as they, see whether it's CISA and FBI advisories or private sector cybersecurity companies release more and more information that indicate that due to an international conflict, cyber attacks are increasing? What baseline recommendations, whether they are public or internal or external facing, would you encourage organizations to adopt? And feel free to jump in.
Well, I think a critical first step would be candor, even if there is a penalty to be paid in the marketplace, and that may require a partnership with the national security community, whether it's the intelligence agencies or CISO or other designated cyber bodies. But having a place to go to engage with a discussion and a full disclosure, whether under existing policy or those that have been discussed in these various yet to be ripened legislative proposals, are essential. There is, especially for a publicly traded company that has to operate under a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders, there's no substitute for candor.
I think a lot of what Michael is saying goes along, what I've been saying all this time about collaboration. If there's information coming out that you're starting to get concerned about, you're not sure what to do about, reach out to your peers, reach out to your local agencies, reach out to, there's many discussions that happen, that are confidential, that you can get information. There's a lot of great organizations out there, CISO groups, security groups, et cetera, that you can join. You're not alone. That's a big thing, is to realize that you're not alone. A lot of people are concerned and worried, and you can share knowledge and learn from each other. I think that's, the security community is such a wonderful community now. We collaborate, we share, we help each other, and become part of it.
I would echo that 100%. I like to say that the rising tide lifts all the boats, and I think there are security community is really good at sharing information. In recent years, a few years ago maybe less so, but there's now plenty of special interest groups. There's CISO communities, there's threat intelligence communities, there's communities organized around certain criminal or nation state threats. And there's a lot of collaboration that happens, with appropriate legal oversight, focus on user privacy, things like that. But within the sort of, the operating confines of each organization, there's a lot that can get done to, essentially disrupt the attackers, kind of take the arrows out of their quiver really quickly, and to make sure that we're all a lot safer. So and the government has a good role to play in there. CISA has been doing a great job of, helping, set up some of those communications channels and facilitating the exchange of information, which has been really, really great to see.
One last final point to throw in behind Sean there, get to know your local FBI representatives as well. They're a wealth of knowledge. They'll come in and speak to you, speak to your teams and stuff like that. They're foster that relationship. It's really important.
I'd like to amplify Sean and Laura there and just say, since we're here at the ICIT, also your ISACs, right? So if you're in critical infrastructure, you have an ISAC dedicated to you. Make sure you have appropriate personnel contributing to those, collaborating with the other folks, sharing information, learning, all the threat indicators, all the reports. There's great information that you can get from your ISACs, and there's all the other collaborative bodies as well that were already mentioned. So it takes a lot, it takes effort, but you may want to think about focusing some of your workforce on that to develop those relationships to get to the point. I'll amplify Director Easterly too, and her goal with JCDC, right, is to get to the point where we're exercising together, we're learning how to do these things quicker, faster, better. And I think all of that's important to get to where we need to be.
Wonderful. Well, to be respectful of everyone's time, I'm going to say I think we could probably go on for quite a bit longer with the nuances of this topic. So let's maybe put a stop here and say that this concludes the Q2 ICIT Fellows Insights discussion. I want to take this opportunity to thank each of today's panelists for being cybersecurity thought leaders and for providing their expert perspectives on this very complicated and very nuanced topic. You guys did a great job, and I hope that our audience really appreciates this discussion.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.